Well, hi, and welcome to another of our NWBA midweek reflections, which I hope you'll find an encouragement and perhaps may also want to share with one or two other people. You know, the Bible contains many profound truths and statements that still find their way into literature, into the speeches of great leaders, words that might be centuries old but have lost none of their power to inspire us. And many of those words come from the lips of Jesus. In fact, we find a whole collection of some of Jesus' most quoted sayings just before the scripture reading that I want to share with you. And compared to some of those, this might feel like a very ordinary story, but let's look at that first. It's right at the end of Matthew chapter 7, and I'm going to read from verse 24 onwards. And this is Jesus speaking. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down in torrents, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain came down in torrents, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. Now, like I said, compared to some of the profound things that Jesus says in the preceding couple of chapters, this might not be remembered as some great narrative that's up there with the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalm. But I want to suggest to you that it's even more important because it asks us a really searching question. Okay, you may have some great words, you may be able to recall or recite them off by heart, but what are you going to do with them? How are they going to affect your life? Because Jesus basically offers us a very simple contrast here. You can hear these words of mine, you can write them down, you can put them on posters, you can stick them on cards, but the key question is, are you going to do anything about them? Not admire them, quote or agree that they're great, but actually put them into practice. Because to put it bluntly, what Jesus says is, my words are as useless as a house built without proper foundations if all you're going to do is stick them in a frame and look at them. So that's the question that Jesus confronts us with here. Are you going to let my words impact you, shape you, change your attitudes and behaviour? Are you going to be someone who hears these words of mine and does something about them? Or are you going to be someone who hears these words and does nothing about them? Now, I guess that, like most people who grew up as part of a local church community, I learnt about this story from a very early age, and I can remember singing songs with great glee and exaggeration as we all sang about how the foolish man's house fell flat. It's a great story. It's a bit of a daft story, if we're honest, but then it's supposed to be a daft story because Jesus is saying you're daft if you don't put my words into practice. But if I'm honest, I never really thought about this story more deeply until I was much older, and I guess was regularly preaching sermons and was probably working as a minister. And as I explored my own deep down feelings about this story, I began to realise that I'd almost seen it as Jesus giving us some really important building advice. You know, I don't think I'd done it consciously, but I'd kind of gone at this story almost as if there were builders in the crowd when Jesus first spoke it. And, oh wow, thank you, Jesus. That's why my houses keep falling down. I need to dig proper footings and foundations. Well, I think we need to see these two builders as more than just an illustration of the importance of taking good advice. Jesus as the great building inspector of life, as it were. But really see this as a model of discipleship. You know, as I look at this story, one of the first things that really strikes me is the way that it's structured. There's a whole load of repetition as the experiences of the two builders are kind of placed and presented to us side by side. And as we reflect on that, you can see that in reality, there are far more similarities between the two of them than there are differences. They both build houses, they both dig foundations, they both experience the torrents and the floodwaters and the wind. You know, when we're going through tough or unexpected times, we often find ourselves asking questions about faith. Why is this happening to me? Isn't God supposed to protect us from stuff like this? Why do I feel as I do? And I wonder if sometimes we generate an understanding of faith that somehow prevents us going through the struggles. But actually, if you think about it, Jesus presents it the other way round. It's the rock builder who anticipates the storms and the traumas, not the sand builder. To build on the foundation that Jesus commends is to prepare for tough times, not to anticipate an easy ride. And I think that's important for us to recognise, because struggles like this can be difficult enough without feeling at the same time we've got some sense of duty to keep a kind of spiritual upper lip and a big smile on our face, or feeling that we've somehow got it wrong if we're surrounded by turmoil, because we've been equipped for it. So let's maybe remind ourselves of what Jesus doesn't say in this story. He doesn't say that the person who builds on sand faces the storms and the wind and the floods, but the house built on the rock has some kind of divine force field around it to avoid the wind and the floods and the torrents. They both went through the same experience. They both faced the same traumas and turmoils. And I think we need to hold on for that for a minute. Our faith is not an escape hatch to help us avoid the struggles of this world, but a foundation, something to rest our weight on, to hold us fast in the storm. And that isn't easy. Why on earth would anyone build on sand in the first place? What possible incentive is there to build on a foundation that you know won't last? Well, the answer's simple. Because it's easier. Digging on rock is tough. It's demanding. Jesus didn't promise us an easy road. He promised us a foundation that we could rely on. So if you're finding things tough at the moment, don't beat yourself up. You've got enough to cope with without feeling guilty about struggling with it. And don't imagine that God has somehow let you down or deserted you. Jesus didn't say, my words will stop this tough stuff from coming. He said, my words will sustain you through the struggle. And maybe I'm reading too much into the story, but I find it interesting that Jesus kind of layers reality on reality. He doesn't mince his words. The rain comes in torrents, the floodwaters rise, the winds beat against the house. Floods, well, they're the consequence of the rain. So it's almost as if there's something sustained about what Jesus is describing here, not just some odd hiccup that comes our way. And then the wind comes. And I guess it's the wind that blows the house over, but it blows the house over because the torrents and the floods have done their worst. They've washed away the foundations. Now, okay, before this turns into a lesson in civil engineering, the point I'm making is that what eventually happens is the consequence of a sustained struggle. And why do I find that interesting? Well, I've been reading some stuff from those who know about these things, about the difference between shock and trauma. And whereas shock is something that comes at us suddenly and in the moment, trauma is more of a build-up of events and experiences, a bit like the rain and then the floods and then the wind coming at us from every angle, the rain from above, the floods from below, the wind from the sides. So if you feel that at the moment, then the first thing to grasp is, well, that's normal. Because what we're all facing at the moment is a situation of sustained struggle, of trauma. And it seems that what Jesus is saying, Jesus, the word become flesh, is I'm equipping you for that. So don't panic when that happens. Just check your foundations. Because the house collapses, not because of the wind and the rain and the floods, but because these things have washed the foundations away. Now, I think we've all been made to think about our foundations in recent days. So much of what we're used to, so much of what we rely on has been taken away. And our society is struggling. But I'm already beginning to recognise that there are some very different narratives that we can choose to tell. So, for example, our economy is shrinking. We're in a downturn, a recession. But air pollution's never been so low. Carbon emissions have been significantly reduced. Now, I know we can be very simplistic about these things, and I don't want to get into playing one off against the other. But what I would invite you to do is to ask, okay, so what is my foundation? If we think back to the two builders for a moment, when the rain and the storms come, it's the builder on sand who has every reason to panic. Now, I know this is only an illustration, but if it had been a real story, then at that point, the rock builder has a choice. Do I take my cue from the other house builder, who is now in an absolutely justified state of panic? Or do I take my cue from my foundation? Do I take my cue from the fact that I've built on a rock? And I make this point because we are all social creatures. We feed off one another's emotions. We pick up the atmosphere and our mood can be impacted by it. And so how we evaluate the stories and the narratives that we hear will depend upon what our foundations are. And I'm not saying that we should just shrug our shoulders and ignore what's going on around us. But this to me is why it is so important that we don't just allow ourselves to be carried along in the tide of popular opinion. We need to set time aside to look at our foundations. We need to see the wind and the rain and the floods in the light of our foundations, not through the eyes of the panicking sand builder. Take notice of the words of Jesus. Make them the foundation that you build on. This to me is at the heart of this story of these two builders. So, what words of Jesus do you need to hear right now? Perhaps you could do with spending some time just getting in touch with your own feelings. Or maybe you're struggling with this whole isolation thing. Maybe you're totally on your own and you don't have anyone to share your feelings with. Or maybe you've been taking it out on the people that you're in lockdown with. Or maybe you're a key worker and you're feeling the pressure at the moment. Or perhaps you're afraid of your own vulnerability. But I just want to invite you to find some time and space and find a place where you know you can reflect and be undisturbed and just allow those things to be placed before God and let the words of Jesus become your foundation. Reflect on your foundation. And so, find some space to do that, as I always say. And some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself. What's bothering you right now? What are your equivalents to the rain, the floods and the wind? What are the constant worries and narratives that are forever drizzling down? What are the feelings and fears that are rising up within you? What are the pressures and pushes that are blasting you from side to side? Don't hide those things away from God. Hold them before God. Offer them to God. And as I said, focus on your foundation. And who are you listening to? This story comes at the end of a whole sequence of contrast. Jesus has talked about the wide and the narrow gate, the true and the false prophets, true and false disciples. And this is another in that series of contrasts. And I think that's why foundations are such a central feature of this kind of summary story. The hidden underlying foundation. These two people may be doing the same thing on the surface, but only one of them is undergirded by something reliable. So again, perhaps what we need to think about at the moment is not so much what we're hearing and listening to, but what underlies those narratives. Who's telling them? And what's their foundation? Are we listening and to those who are speaking from the right foundation? Whose words are you putting into practice? And then, what words of Jesus particularly matter to you? I've already mentioned that this illustration comes at the end of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. So if you can't think of any, maybe just look at some of the things that Jesus says in chapters 5 and 6 and 7. Let them sink in. And if they're familiar words, take time to think about what they mean for you in the here and now. What does it mean for you to put them into practice, as Jesus says? And then, what are your foundations? Your whole life has been affected by recent events, and we're all different people. So don't assume that you have to react in the same way that others do. Remember, building on rock is the tough option. So if you're finding faith a bit of an uphill struggle, don't beat yourself up for that. Be open and honest with God and let the words of Jesus encourage and sustain you. Let them be your foundation. And I know I say this every week, but I really would encourage you to get in touch with someone else. someone who's watching this video as a watch partner with you, because I want you to ask yourself another question. What words of Jesus that have come to your mind might be a word that you could offer to someone else, someone who maybe needs to hear them? And as you've been reflecting on the words of Jesus, has someone come to mind? Have they been brought to your mind for a reason? So think about those things for a while. And we're all building in the midst of quite a storm at the moment, but I hope these few thoughts will help you to just reach down again to your foundations. Thanks for listening.